right, Sinen, what was the thing that most encouraged you in the preparation and delivery of the sermon?
In the preparation, I just loved 1 Samuel. I just loved the text and how the authors put it. Felt like I was becoming a Christian because of the way he assembled. I just got excited. I just loved it. Delivery, yeah, there are a few points. So I was trying to work on some of the feedback I've got in previous sermons. So wielding my gospel connection. So that just got me excited.
Baxter.
Yeah, thanks, brother. That was an encouraging word. I think I was most encouraged by the part in your gospel connection where you spoke of God allowing his own detainment to bring shame to his enemies. And that was encouraging just as we experience the frustrations or the ineffectiveness of this world and ministry, and God allowing it ultimately and promising to bring shame. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I thought that this idea that entrusting ourselves to God is not only something we should do, but something that is encouraging to me, because I was like, oh yeah, I can do that because he beats his enemies. Just a good reminder.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to that, the idea that you can entrust yourself to God's hand even when it looks terrible, because he's stronger.
I did it, just trusting in God to really back you as a pastor, minister. Yeah. Trust God's mighty hand, his right hand.
Yeah, for me it was, when you're being critiqued and being mocked or derided or in ministry, to know that it's just like the appearance, but that actually your opposition is a joke and God's overcoming that. So encouraging.
Yeah, I think really similarly with what everyone said, but just the kind of way you presented the gospel got me excited, like you were saying about that. And then as you moved into kind of how that works in our lives, that was really encouraging.
Yeah, again, I'll hit on the same note again as everyone else, but I think what was really most impactful was that application after the gospel connection for me of like God lets this happen so that he can show his power, which was helpful, but also kind of confronting too, because I can get in that moment where I'm like, well, why don't you do something about God? Like, I'm just, come on, dude. But it's like there is purpose, there is point, and that was just a good also confrontation as well as bolster up and lifting. So.
All right, and where did you see an opportunity for growth in this sermon?
I think Jeremy used the image of the cube when we're reflecting on Christendom. So I wanted to turn the cube a little bit more in terms of my applications and wield the text a little bit more, so to ground it practically in different scenarios in ministry. So I felt that pain. I was having so much fun in the text. I was just like, oh man, you're not applying this as you want to. So that was a bit painful.
Baxter?
Yeah, I guess my thoughts would be just on the 3 movements of the text. At some point somehow I got lost. I don't know how, but just I wasn't sure if it was not knowing the specific verses that corresponded to the specific movements up front. Yeah. But I got lost because that wasn't said, and I was just a little confused. Maybe it wasn't stated plainly enough how each of these movements are driving towards your argument. It did feel more explanatory, but I realize this is narrative and this is, we're just going through narrative, so we're coming from epistles where it does feel like you can build, but it felt very explanatory, the movements.
Yeah, for better, for worse, I kind of
Right.
deliberately went that route.
Mhm.
So, yeah, good comment.
So I thought you had some good things in your gospel connection, but it's probably not a good idea to compare Jesus to the false idol that gets busted into pieces. And then double down on it again.
Yeah, I was lying to that. Just kidding. Good point.
So you pointed out that God is upset with his own people also in this passage,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you didn't really explain
Yeah,
why,
yeah.
like why the ark left and why
Yeah.
he was upset with his people.
Yeah, so I tried to work that in the first point, but when I said that, I realized, oh man, there's not much there to support exactly what you're saying. So thank you for that. We'll clean that up.
I think someone might have mentioned this already. I think I would appreciate it, maybe in the beginning, a preview of your 3 points.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Baxter on the 3 points.
Yep.
I wonder if instead of, it didn't actually seem to be what you were arguing, what you titled them to be. So like you said, God's ark was detained, but you were actually, again, that's very descriptive, but you were actually trying to say, only God appears to be detained. And that's what you actually said, something like that later. And then you could actually show like the logic between the 3
Yeah.
moves. Although he appears to be detained,
Mhm.
actually that's not
That's
the
it.
case because he attacks
Yeah.
point 2, and then he's driven away point 3. And so
Yeah.
now you actually could show the kind of
Yeah, that's
moves
good.
between.
Like that.
So yeah, moving from like
What's
that
the
just felt very
What's the first A? You give
appears,
me 2
he
A.
appears to be
yes, yes,
detained.
yes.
He attacks
good.
and driven away. But it just seemed like that was so historically descriptively.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I didn't have.
Whereas some of the other bits were homiletical, and you used that other language that I just thought that could be incorporated into your point better.
Good.
I'll speak to what you kind of mentioned. Yeah, I agree with you. I thought your applications were good, but I would have liked them to have been developed more,
Yeah.
particularly your first one.
I felt that.
You asked us a question, how do you cope with, like enemies in ministry or something like that? And then you just pretty much left. Like, we didn't really think about, you didn't give us maybe like positive ways to cope or things like
Yeah,
that. So,
into the cube.
yeah.
Man.
I guess I'll dogpile on. I was definitely lost as well, but I think what I want to say from that, which I just lost as Riza said that. What was my point? Oh, because I was lost, and then because it wasn't super clearly stated up front. By the time you got to your gospel connection in point 2, I thought then that application, and then you said something else that it felt like we were heading towards a conclusion. And so I was getting ready and bolstered up for that. So by the time that you hit point 3, I was like, oh, wait, we're still hitting that momentum. And I kind of got lost. And I think that's what I was going to say, sorry. I think that's just because the transition between 1 and 2 was maybe just a little
A bit fuzzy.
fuzzy, yeah, but yeah.
Baxter, you got another one?
Yeah, I just thought the ending, maybe it's similar to what Jeremy just said, but I felt like the ending, I was expecting more, and maybe
Yeah.
it's because the gospel connection was so rich that it felt like we came back down and then ended. Yeah, I don't
I
know if
agree,
there's maybe
yeah.
a closing
Yeah,
illustration or
yeah,
something like
yeah.
that would have really
I
helped
actually
to tie it all together for us.
thought about that when I ended. Man, this means just that. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. That was helpful.
So when you went back at the beginning to do some context stuff, you went to like 1 Samuel 4, then you went to Exodus, then you came back to 1 Samuel 4,
Yeah.
I was like, wait, hold on, where are we? So that was just confusing, like jump around.
Clarify that,
Yeah.
I think you left me with a lot of questions about who are my enemies in ministry. I mean, I don't know, because I think
Yeah.
ministry is hard, and so there are people who maybe mock your preparations, but it sort of left me feeling like, man, I really gotta figure out who my enemies in ministry are.
Take them out.
Yeah, it's part of my application cube thing. So the set, because I was too scared to do that. So I just don't say anything. Let them think about. So I deliberately chose it, but it would have helped to clarify who are your enemies versus God's enemies. We're talking about God's enemies here, and to be helpful. It's going to be better.
I got nothing else.
That's good.
Yeah, for me, especially you talked about enemies in the first half of the text, and in your first like point and a half or so, without drawing a distinction between like Dagon and the people. And so you talked about Dagon a lot, but without any significance as to like what that might mean now that God is defeating or able to defeat this kind of enemy. Whereas it's actually like once you get to what is like verse 6 or something where the hand is heavy against the people. So there's like a shift there that didn't, I don't know, it didn't get brought out. Obviously, like the people we're seeing, like, or like, what would it look like for God to beat a Dagon now, and how would that be different than the going against the people?
This is kind of a small thing, but something to think about. You had a great line at the end of your introduction, something like God's tour is seriously funny but surprisingly fatal, which was a good line. But then you pretty quickly went into like, and that sounded like that's maybe his argument. But then you went into this other statement, you know, like my argument's God's hand destroys those who defy his glory, so just be careful of that proximity. But then the other problem was later on in your second point, you repeated the first one, God's tour is seriously funny but surprisingly fatal again. And I don't know that you really repeated the statement you said was your argument at all throughout. So just like there was some kind of dissonance there.
So I weaved it into the gospel language, and I had it at the beginning and the end. And this kind of, so I wanted also to draw out the kind of humorous side and the shock of it. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, wasn't like a big deal by any means, but just something to be aware of, be careful with.
Definitely, because that could come out as the main.
Exactly.
So this is a super, super tiny one. It really doesn't matter, but I just found it humorous. But I guess it does matter, because anyways, there's one point in point 2 after the Mike Tyson application where you said hook up. You said something about God's going to hook up with the Philistines. Which I understood after you did the motion, but at first I was like, wait, whoa. God's going to what with the Philistines? American culture, very different.
You have to just move on.
Yeah.
So I caught that. I was like, well, I'm not going to explain this or dig my hole.
Yeah.
I was moving on. Get the feedback.
Yeah, and the motion helped, definitely.
So thank you for that.
Super small, but it was good. Or bad, I don't know.
Appreciate.
All right. Well, what were you happy with, Sinen, in your work?
Yeah, so still like trying to wield my argument to allow everything to kind of come through that thing. Gospel particularly. So try to work on that a bit harder than I usually do. So.
I am going to choose kind of how you played into the irony of the text. I really enjoyed, specifically in your first point, how you said, never have the enemies of God seemed so strong. You talked about them out-muscling God's people, or even God's presence. Yeah, I just thought that was well done to build up the irony of this strength and how it led into the irony we see later continued with Dagon bowing down to God. So yeah, I thought you did a nice job propping that up to serve your point.
Yeah, so I thought that while maybe bounced around in a not so helpful way with the context, I thought it was a good way to get into the context. And you'd have been terrified if you'd have seen this, like, let me tell you like how they got here. And it was brief, and it was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I know this story forward and backward, and I still enjoyed hearing it.
I'm actually gonna go against one of the critiques I just heard, so sorry, Bondon. I heard you say in your first point that the way that we deal with
Sure.
it seeming like the enemies have the upper hand is that we must entrust ourselves to God, who destroys. And I heard you say it in your second point. It doesn't matter how bad it is, entrust yourself to God's hand, who destroys those. And then I heard it in the end. So I heard your argument throughout the entire thing.
No, yeah, it's not really disagreeing with Bonded, but for someone else it could have landed a different way. So I hear him and I receive your praise.
Wow, what a unifier. The new Mandela.
The Rainbow Bridge.
Good job, you guys are wicked. Thanks, Martin.
But throughout the whole sermon, you kept me engaged the way you delivered it.
Great text.
I loved how you used humor and irony in a few ways. One, you took what could be a really heavy text, like, even though it's written humorously, like, the point is, like, God is destroying, like, his enemies, right? And so you used, like, the comedy thing and your tone and the language you used, and without minimizing the seriousness of it, like, seriously funny, right? Which was great. And you also kept hearkening back to the comedy language that you introduced at the beginning, like, yeah, seriously funny, the opposition is a joke, Jesus came on tour, so there were a whole bunch of ways that you used the vocabulary from your introduction throughout that helped bring some cohesion. Also, the tone of the comedy hit the kind of ironic nature of the text and also made it more pleasing for the hearer, right?
I thought overall your gospel connection was strong, particularly just like the way you went into it, because you had some statements where, you know, you didn't like outright, you know, kind of make the connection. You had some statements that let us be like, oh yeah, like I can see this connection he's making there. And then I think you even said something like, I bet you can see, you know, where I'm going with this, or something like that. So yeah, I like what you did, how you did that. And then I thought your gospel connection was strong and really tied to the text well.
Yeah, I'll triple up on Baxter and Kevin. I think it was interesting because at first when you started with the Kevin Hart imagery, I was like, or introduction, I was utterly confused about where on earth you were going with that. But then it made a lot of sense. But also what I really liked about it, like they're saying, is you brought that, you took a really harsh text and kind of lightened it a little bit, which was, I think, in this case, nice or helpful. But at the same time, you have this thread of keeping that joke up, but also, while lightening it, giving that undertone of like, it's a joke because of how powerful God is and how he could just demise you in a second, kind of. So I don't know, I thought it was handled well, but also that through line of kind of keeping that joke idea going. I held it together a lot, really well for me. I thought that was really cool, an interesting way to do that, but I thought it worked well as well.
Baxter?
I want to talk about your gospel connection as well. I thought it was great, and you talked about wanting to practice wielding it. I think from what I've heard, this was the best gospel connection you've had so far, and very well wielded. I particularly appreciated it was in the second point. I know that brings challenges, but it did underline like kind of the central part of the message in the central part of God and Dagon being shamed before God. And so I thought the way that you wielded the gospel connection along with, like in the context of that point, was was really well done.
Yeah, I thought you did a few things throughout where you just kind of highlight a detail where a lot of people would get bogged down and just like over explain it. So for example, you were like, you pointed out like how these people were, in each of these towns were super selfish. They're only really thinking of themselves. They're just like, how can we get this away from here? And so they'd send it on to the next place because they were just like thinking. So that, just that thing goes like, oh yeah. So you're highlighting kind of one of the things that's happening in the text, but then we're just off it, right? We're moving on. So I thought that was really well done. And it kind of flowed from one point to another. So it did feel like you were telling a story up there.
I agree with all the praise about your gospel connection, and I thought you had a line in there, God played his hand at the cross, that just tied it so beautifully to your argument. I thought that was great.
Yeah. Stephen?
I also like how you use the analogy to make your gospel connection. In addition, I liked how I think you was weaving through how God doesn't, I think, have a problem with appearing to be weak, right? And yet, it's almost it's a setup later to magnify his strength. So I like that.
I'm gonna go with your reading of the scripture. I just thought was really well done, drawing attention to things that you emphasized, and your tone throughout in delivering. It's good.
I think another way you wielded your gospel connection was the application following it was just like really deeply tied to it. That was probably your strongest application in my opinion. I thought that was well done. It was a good move.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm impressed by how you weave things through. So all of your application points almost had this bit of the irony of God looking weak to then overcome. And I especially thought it was most palpable, although I agree with Jeremy, it's a dangerous image to use of Christ keep falling down, but the image of, yeah, he looked like he was dead and gone, but then, you know, it's a kind of the culmination, all your application led to this gospel connection, but it looked like it there too, but then he won once for all, and then you kind of move that forward. So I thought that you weaved that well through application and then kind of helped it blossom in your gospel connection in a really cool way. Yeah, so I thought that was really, really interesting to see, really cool to see you do that, and helpful.
All right.
That's
There it is.
brothers and sisters.
All right, brother. There it is.